that rhetoric guy. Rhetoric. This is not an easy concept to wrap your mind around. If you look in the dictionary, you might find a big, broad study of type of definition, like the study of persuasion. On the other hand, if you go to a high school English class, your teacher might just give you a bunch of terms to master, like knowing the difference between different types of repetition, alliteration, anaphora, anadiplosis, assonance. Okay. On the other hand, entirely, if you listen to the mainstream media or news, rhetoric is often used entirely in the negative, the pejorative, as if rhetoric equals lying politician. So how can we condense and synthesize all of these different definitions into something that's a little bit more understandable and actionable? Well, that's what this series is for, and specifically this video is about those definitions and concepts so you have a good foundation on which to begin. Stick around. Okay, so I tend to understand things better with comparisons. So, analogy time. In kindergarten, I was given an assignment to practice a short book over a weekend and then read that book to the class on the following Monday. After roping my dad into listening to me, I carefully sounded out all the words, making my way through the book twice. Now, the word island showed up a few times, and each time I pronounced it in my nasally confused voice, Island. Now, my dad never corrected me. So the next Monday, as I stood in class and I began reading aloud, something happened. Out of my mouth came the correct pronunciation of island, along with a more fluid reading, rather than the stuttering sounds I made earlier in practice. So wait, what happened? I mean, no one corrected me. Well, in that moment, I became a reader. I realized through experience that reading was active. It was something I had to be engaged with. It required my participation, my genuine attention. Before, when I practiced, the words and the syllables that I sounded out were all disconnected. I went through the motions of reading without actually reading because I didn't realize that I was a part of the reading experience. I thought this was just sounds on a page. Now, sadly, my dad died a few years later, so I can't comment on whether this was an intentional strategy on his part to get me to organically learn, or if he was simply just lazy and bored listening to a 5-year-old make sounds. But what I can say is that in that moment in class, when I finally participated with enough attention to connect the sounds in my head, instead of sounding them out individually, I realized the difference and the connection between words, nouns, things, and to read, a verb, an action. Rhetoric is that connection. Rhetoric is the glue that connects language, a thing, a noun, with to communicate, a verb, an action. It's the glue that gives individual pieces a greater meaning. All right, so from that kind of cerebral, conceptual definition, let's try to bring it down to something a little bit more concrete. We have to go back a few thousand years and take a look at Aristotle. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he wrote a whole big long treatise, a big long essay or book about the subject of persuasion. Now, there's way too much to cover here in any detail, but we can start with one of his simple questions. Can you see the means by which someone is trying to persuade you? Not just can you tell if someone is trying to persuade you, but can you tell how? Can you tell why? Now, those means can be a lot of different things, but Aristotle kind of condensed them into three main, what we call appeals. You have ethos, the character appeal. You have logos, the logical appeal. And you have pathos, the emotional appeal. Now, I have a whole second video on those terms specifically. You can check that out if you want. But for right now, let's just leave it at that. So aside from some obvious nuances I'm leaving out for simplification, these three appeals were basically the entirety of what people thought rhetoric was. You had a certain character, you appealed through logic and emotion, and those were the ways that we persuaded. Those were the means. Aristotle saw these means as positive forces, artistic forces, that would really help us, because once we study them and understand them and then apply them, we can begin to navigate really complex issues like democracy and science and tradition and so on, because we're able to kind of get in the heads of other humans. And it allows us to understand why we do what we do. It was kind of like a proto-attempt at psychology and sociology and marketing and advertising and linguistics and logic. All of that kind of combined into one. But see, people quickly realized the more cynical nature of this art. Since rhetoric doesn't always work in pursuit of truth, because it's a tool and not a goal in and of itself, it could be used in dangerous ways and potentially even counterproductive ways. I mean, think about propaganda. Propaganda has its roots in rhetorical manipulation, and propaganda is ultimately the opposite of Aristotle's kind of positive artistic view of rhetoric, because propaganda is about confusing people and misleading people. So just like all tools, rhetoric has evolved over the years from these kind of simple appeals into a much bigger field. It's a field that encompasses lots of big, broad definitions and moving parts. Think about engineering. Engineering is more than just math and building. It's a field that encompasses math and physics and assembly and construction and safety and accessibility and redundancy and efficiency, materials science. It has all of these aspects in it. And rhetoric is a field, just like engineering is a field. And that's why it's hard to pin down with kind of a single definition. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of definitions that I've used in the past that are both specific and comprehensive. 1, the art and science of manipulating language to achieve a goal. Notice here that it's both creative and mechanical. If you don't really understand the logical chain of ideas, if you don't really understand grammar, then persuasion is not going to really make sense to you. But likewise, if you don't have a creative mind, an innovative mind, a mind that sees and thinks outside the box, then you're also less likely to really understand rhetoric. 2, how and why to make choices about your communication tactics. Notice that choice is really important. In fact, that is one of the critical aspects to rhetoric. It is about what you choose to do. Hopefully you have reasons for those choices. Hopefully there is a way in which you can think about persuading people in a very precise way. And analyzing our choices is basically learning rhetoric. 3, learning how to intentionally change someone's mind. Notice that there's a goal here. Rhetoric itself doesn't have a goal. Rhetoric is a tool, but rhetoric is a tool that facilitates getting to a goal. If you don't really have a purpose, if you don't really have a reason to be writing, how are you going to persuade people? If you're analyzing somebody else's writing, how can you really understand how they persuaded if you don't really understand what their goal was? 4, studying how purposefully created language affects a chosen audience. Notice that there's a relationship here. It is a connection between the speaker and the audience and, of course, the message that you're giving that audience. If you haven't thought through all the different nooks and crannies of that relationship, you're not going to really understand rhetoric. 5, persuasion and manipulation. Sometimes trying to be short and sweet helps. Notice here that it's not about truth. It's about perspective. If you want truth, go to philosophy. If you want to accurately describe and explain and predict reality, go to science. But if you want to understand how to manipulate language because of perspective, that's rhetoric. And finally, 6, developing a personal voice and style in order to be understood and believed and followed. Notice that it's something that you actively practice. This isn't just, I'm going to learn about it in school and then I'll be able to do it. It's something that requires work. Hope that helps.